What happens when the snow falls so deep that the world shrinks to the distance between two cabins? When winter stretches so long that the face of a neighbor begins to feel less like comfort and more like calculation? Tonight, we drift into a frontier where isolation was not the cruelest hardship, where instead it was proximity that carried the deepest unease. We'll move through cabins separated by frozen fields, through days measured in dwindling stores and lengthening silences, through a season that tested not courage, but trust itself. Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's grip on the frontier settlements of early America, I'd ask a small kindness. Press the like button if you will, and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these midnight passages through forgotten corners of the past can continue to find you. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are right now, what time shows on your clock, whether you're wrapped in the stillness of deep night or just beginning your day somewhere far from here. Now let the light fade around you, perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that soft background hum that helps the mind settle, and let's begin our slow walk through a winter where neighbors became something other than friends. You wake in darkness so complete it feels like a physical presence pressing against the small window of your cabin. The cold has seeped through the gaps in the logs during the night, and you can see your breath in the air, even though the embers in the hearth still glow faintly beneath their blanket of ash. Outside, the wind moves across the frozen fields with a sound like distant conversation, though no one is there. You know this because you've learned to distinguish every sound the wilderness makes from the sounds that mean another person is approaching. Your hands are stiff as you reach for the poker, stirring the coals back to reluctant life. Each piece of firewood must be considered now, weighed against the weeks still remaining before any thaw might come. The pile near the door has diminished to a height that makes your stomach tighten when you glance at it. You tell yourself not to count the logs again, but you count them anyway, just as you did yesterday, just as you will tomorrow. Your children sleep in the loft above, their breathing soft and even in the way that makes you grateful and anxious all at once. They'll wake hungry, as they always do now, asking questions about when the stores will be replenished, when spring will arrive, when things will return to the way they remember from warmer months. You move to the corner where the sacks of grain stand in a careful row. Your fingers brush against the canvas, feeling the shape of what remains inside, estimating without opening them because you already know, because you've checked too many times to pretend you don't know exactly how much is left. The bacon hanging from the rafters has been rationed so carefully that each piece feels precious as silver. You've learned to slice it thin enough that the children believe they're eating a full portion, learned to make the fat render out across the pan so the smell fills the cabin and creates the illusion of abundance. Salt pork, cornmeal, dried beans, counted out like currency. These are the measurements by which winter is survived. Each meal planned days in advance, each portion calculated against the uncertain distance to spring. You remember autumn, when neighbors gathered to help with harvests, when there was laughter across the fields and children played between the cabins without thought. That generosity feels like something from a story now, something that belonged to a different world where sharing didn't feel like gambling with your family's survival. The water bucket near the door has frozen overnight despite being kept inside. You'll need to break the ice with the handle of a wooden spoon, then warm it slowly by the fire so the children can wash their faces and hands. Every morning task follows the same pattern, the same careful sequence designed to preserve resources and warmth. You've learned not to waste motion, not to leave the door open a moment longer than necessary, not to burn the fire higher than survival requires. Through the small window, you can see the shape of your nearest neighbor's cabin, perhaps 300 yards, distant across the white expanse. Smoke rises from their chimney in a thin grey line that tells you they're awake as well, beginning their own morning calculations. You wonder, as you do every morning now, how their stores compare to yours, whether they've managed better, whether they're counting their children's portions the same way you count yours. Last week, you saw the husband out gathering deadwood near the property line that's become invisible beneath the snow. He waved and you waved back, but neither of you crossed the distance to speak. There was a time, earlier in the winter, when you might have walked over, might have shared news or offered help. But something has shifted in the past month, something subtle that you can't quite name but can feel in every interaction. It started perhaps when they borrowed your axe and returned it 3 days later than promised. Or maybe it was before that when you asked to borrow their mule for half a day and saw hesitation in their eyes before they agreed. Small things, meaningless things in a different season, but winter has a way of magnifying every slight, every delay, every moment of reluctance. You tell yourself it's natural, that everyone is simply tired and anxious and trying to protect their own. You tell yourself that when spring comes, the old easiness will return, but you don't quite believe it anymore. The children wake, and you help them down from the loft, their faces pinched with cold, despite having slept under every blanket you own. They ask for breakfast, and you begin the familiar process of making something from almost nothing, of stretching portions, of creating the appearance of plenty. Your wife, or husband, depending on who you are in this story, works beside you in practiced silence. You've learned to communicate without words now, learn to coordinate the tasks of survival through glances and small gestures. There's comfort in this efficiency, but also a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical labor. It's the tiredness that comes from constant vigilance, from never quite relaxing, from calculating and recalculating every decision against a future you can't control. After breakfast, there's firewood to gather. You dress in layers that feel both too thin and too heavy, pulling on boots that are beginning to crack at the seams, wrapping cloth around your hands because proper gloves wore out weeks ago. The door opens onto a world bleached colorless by snow and low grey sky. The cold hits your face like a slap, making your eyes water and your lungs seize for a moment before adjusting. You've learned to breathe shallowly out here, to move steadily without hurrying, to conserve body heat while still accomplishing what needs to be done. The woods where you gather deadwood are perhaps half a mile away, a distance that feels infinite when the wind picks up. The snow crunches under your feet with a sound that carries across the emptiness. Sometimes you think you hear other footsteps, other movements in the trees, but when you turn, there's nothing but white silence. You gather what you can find: fallen branches, dead timber, anything that will burn. The pile you collect never seems quite sufficient when you drag it back on the small sledge, never quite matches the amount you've used from the woodpile at home. Other cabins dot the landscape at irregular intervals, each one a small, dark shape against the endless white. You know the families in most of them, know their names and their children's names, know which ones came from which distant settlements, but knowing them feels different now than it did 6 months ago. Then they were neighbors in the full sense, people you could rely on, people who would help when help was needed. Now they're something else, something more complicated. Still neighbors, still people you'd likely assist in a genuine emergency, but also people whose needs might conflict with your own, whose survival might come at the cost of yours. You've heard the stories, passed along in careful whispers during those rare moments when someone travels between cabins. Stories of borrowed tools not returned, of promised help that never materialized, of families who arrived at a door asking for food and left with hard feelings on both sides. No dramatic betrayals, no violent confrontations, just a slow erosion of the bonds that are supposed to hold communities together. Just winter wearing away at trust the way it wears away at everything else. Back at the cabin, you stack the firewood with care, arranging it so you can see exactly how much you have, so you can continue your endless mental accounting. Your hands are raw and red, aching with a cold that goes deeper than skin. The afternoon passes in the usual tasks, mending, preparing the evening meal, teaching the children their letters by firelight, trying to keep spirits up despite the weight of confinement. Your cabin feels smaller each day, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. Sometimes you step outside just to breathe air that doesn't taste of wood smoke and bodies and dwindling hope. Sometimes you stand in the doorway and look out at the other cabins and wonder what conversations are happening inside them, what calculations, what fears. In the evening, as the light dies early and the cold intensifies, you hear footsteps approaching through the snow. Your body tenses before your mind fully registers the sound, some animal instinct recognizing the pattern of human movement. A knock comes at the door. 3 sharp raps that seem loud in the quiet cabin. You exchange a glance with your wife, see your own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. Who comes calling after dark in winter? What need could be urgent enough to brave the cold and the distance? You open the door to find your neighbor from the south, the one whose cabin you can just see from your eastern window. He's wrapped in layers of worn fabric, his face red and chapped, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. He asks to borrow cornmeal, just a small amount, enough to get his family through until he can make it to the trading post when the weather breaks. His voice is steady, but you can hear the effort it takes to keep it that way. You invite him in out of politeness, out of the old habits of hospitality that haven't quite died despite everything. He stands near the door, not wanting to intrude, not wanting to take warmth that isn't his. The conversation is brief, formal in a way that conversations between neighbors shouldn't be. You find yourself calculating as he speaks how much cornmeal you have, how much you can spare, what giving it away might mean for your own family's survival. You think about the axe he borrowed last month, about the way his smoke sometimes rises thick from his chimney while yours must stay thin. You think about trust and obligation and what neighbors owe each other when owing anything might be too much. In the end, you give him what he asks for, measuring it out with careful precision. He thanks you with equal formality, promising to return it when he can, though both of you know that such promises are often broken by circumstance rather than intention. After he leaves, the cabin feels colder despite the closed door. Your wife asks quietly if you think you should have given more or less, and you realize you don't know the answer. The children are watching from the loft, old enough to sense the tension, even if they don't fully understand it. You tell them to sleep, that everything is fine, using the voice parents use when they're not quite sure if what they're saying is true. Night settles fully over the frozen landscape, bringing with it a darkness so complete that it feels like burial. You lie awake in your own bed, listening to the wind, thinking about the neighbor who came to your door and the other neighbors who haven't. You wonder who else is lying awake right now, who else is counting and calculating and worrying. You wonder if they think about you the same way you think about them, as both potential help and potential threat, as both community and competition. Winter, you've learned, doesn't just test your ability to endure cold and hunger. It tests something more fundamental, your capacity to remain human in a season that seems designed to strip away everything that makes humanity bearable. The days repeat themselves with variations so minor they barely register. You wake, you ration, you gather, you worry, you sleep poorly, you wake again. Sometimes a week passes without seeing another person beyond your own family. The isolation becomes almost comforting in its way, because isolation means you don't have to navigate the complicated math of neighborly relations. But then someone appears, needing something, offering something, just wanting to talk, and you're reminded that isolation isn't safety, it's just postponement of the inevitable decisions about trust and scarcity and survival. You've noticed that certain families burn their fires longer into the evening, suggesting either more wood or less concern about running out. You've noticed which cabins have smoke rising at dawn and which don't stir until later. These observations feel shameful even as you can't stop making them. You're watching your neighbors the way you might watch strangers, looking for signs of weakness or abundance, trying to gauge who might make it through winter and who might not. One afternoon, you see smoke rising from a cabin further north, thicker than usual, darker. For a moment you wonder if something is wrong, if someone needs help. But it's too far to walk in the cold just to check. And what would you do if something was wrong? Your own resources are stretched too thin to offer real assistance. So you watch the smoke, and eventually it returns to normal, and you tell yourself that everything is probably fine. You tell yourself that people can manage their own problems, that you're not responsible for everyone, that you have to think of your own family first. These justifications come easily now, worn smooth by repetition. You barely notice when you're making them anymore. The snow continues to fall intermittently, adding to the already substantial accumulation. The paths you've worn between cabin and woodpile and the small shed where tools are kept become trenches through the white, narrow channels that make you feel simultaneously protected and trapped. Your children ask when they can visit the neighbors' children, when they can play the way they used to. You put them off with vague promises about when the weather improves, knowing that the weather is only part of what keeps the families apart now. The truth is more complicated, more uncomfortable to acknowledge. The truth is that neighborly visiting feels risky in ways that have nothing to do with cold or distance. Every visit means revealing something about your circumstances, about how well you're managing, about what you have and what you lack. Every visit means potential obligation, potential judgment, potential complications you can't afford. So the children stay inside and the families stay separate, and the winter continues its slow work of transforming community into something else. Not quite hostility, but not quite friendship either. Something cautious and guarded and sad. You remember a night last summer when all the nearby families gathered for a celebration after the harvest. There was music and dancing and food shared freely, joy that came from abundance and the pleasure of company. That memory feels unreal now, like something you dreamed or imagined. You can't quite reconcile those laughing, generous people with the wary, calculating individuals you've all become. But you know with a certainty that makes your chest ache that they're the same people. Winter hasn't changed anyone's nature, it's just revealed what happens to human kindness when survival stops being guaranteed. The moral weight of this revelation settles on you in the long, dark hours before dawn. You think about what you would do if a neighbor came asking for food and you had only enough for your own family. You think about what you would do if you were the one asking, if you were the one watching your children grow thinner while knowing that others had what you needed. You think about lines you'd never cross, and then you think about whether those lines would hold if winter lasted long enough. These thoughts don't resolve themselves neatly. They sit in your mind like stones, heavy and cold, a reminder that survival sometimes means living with moral discomfort. The wind picks up again outside, rattling the shutters, finding every gap in the cabin walls. You pull the thin blanket closer and try to sleep, knowing that tomorrow will bring the same routines, the same calculations, the same careful distance from the people who live just 300 yards away across the frozen ground. Let us turn now from your cabin to another, to a winter that happened long ago in a settlement whose name has been lost to time, but whose pattern has been repeated across 1,000 frozen frontiers. This is a story drawn from fragments, diary entries, letters, sent but never answered, the spaces between recorded events where human feeling lives. The man at the center of this story was named Thomas Hendry, though the name matters less than the life he lived and the choices winter forced upon him. He was neither wealthy nor desperately poor, neither particularly virtuous nor notably flawed, just a man trying to shepherd his family through a season that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. Thomas had settled his land 7 years before the winter we're concerned with, arriving with his wife Catherine and their 2 young daughters in a wave of hopeful migration westward. The land was decent enough, the cabin he built solid, the neighbors who gradually appeared around him seeming like good people with whom a community might be built. For 6 years, that community functioned as communities do. Barn raisings brought everyone together, harvests were shared when one family had abundance and another had suffered blight, children played freely between homesteads, and trust was assumed rather than questioned. But the winter of 1798 arrived with unusual severity, bringing snow earlier than expected and cold that settled into the bones of the earth like something permanent. By December, it was clear that this would not be an ordinary winter, that the stores everyone had laid up might not prove sufficient. Thomas kept a journal during those months, not daily, but often enough that we can trace the slow transformation of his thinking, the gradual shift from communal concern to private calculation. In November, his entries speak warmly of neighbors, of mutual aid given and received, of confidence that together they would weather whatever came. By January, the tone has changed. The entries grow shorter, more focused on inventory and weather, less concerned with the doings of other families. He writes about counting supplies, about rationing more strictly than he'd planned, about looking at his daughters and wondering if he's cut their portions too thin or not thin enough. He writes about lying awake at night doing arithmetic in his head, adding and subtracting against an unknown variable, the date spring might arrive. Catherine appears in these entries as a steady presence, someone who manages the household's daily consumption with careful precision. Thomas notes her ability to make meals from almost nothing, her skill at keeping the children's spirits up despite the monotony and cold. But he also notes, in careful language, her growing anxiety about the neighbors. She has begun to mention, more frequently than before, who has come to borrow and what they've borrowed and whether they've returned things promptly. In mid-January, a neighbor family, the Pratts, who lived perhaps a quarter-mile south, came asking to borrow a quantity of salt pork. Their own stores had been damaged by moisture, they explained, and several pieces had gone bad before they discovered the problem. Thomas gave them what they asked for, measuring it out carefully, while trying not to appear calculating. He writes that evening about the exchange, about how Robert Pratt thanked him with stiff formality, about how the conversation felt wrong in ways Thomas couldn't articulate. There was a time, he wrote, when such lending would have been accomplished with easy warmth, with assurances freely given and trust assumed. Now even simple kindness feels weighted with implications neither party wishes to speak aloud. The Pratts promised to repay the salt pork as soon as they were able, likely after Robert made it to the trading post once the worst weather broke. Thomas accepted this promise. What else could he do? And the families parted with expressions of mutual goodwill that both seemed to understand were partly performance. Days passed, then weeks. The promised trip to the trading post didn't materialize. The weather remained too severe, the roads impassable. Thomas didn't mention the debt in his journal immediately, but it began to appear in indirect ways. He noted the smoke rising from the Pratt's chimney, wondered in writing about their remaining stores, calculated quietly on paper what the loss of that salt pork meant for his own family's prospects. In early February, Thomas encountered Robert Pratt near the tree line where both families gathered deadwood. They spoke briefly about the weather, about the stubborn persistence of winter, about hopes for an early thaw. Neither mentioned the borrowed salt pork. Neither mentioned the awkwardness that now existed between their households. Thomas wrote that night about the encounter, about how they'd stood perhaps 10 feet apart in the snow, close enough to speak but maintaining a distance that felt significant. "We talked," he wrote, "as men do when they're both pretending a thing hasn't happened. When acknowledgement would require difficult conversation, neither wants to have." Something had shifted between the families, some invisible line had been crossed, and now both parties found themselves in territory where the old rules of neighborly conduct didn't quite apply. They weren't enemies, nothing so simple or dramatic as that. They were simply two families trying to survive, each aware that the other's survival might complicate their own, each trapped in a web of obligation and resentment and continued dependence that winter had spun around them. The complexity was exhausting, and the exhaustion showed in every interaction. Catherine, Thomas noted, had stopped suggesting that they visit the Pratts socially. When their daughters asked about playing with the Pratt children, she found reasons to postpone such visits: the weather, the cold, someone's minor illness. Thomas understood that these were pretexts, that what Catherine was really doing was protecting their family from further entanglement. He didn't contradict her, didn't insist on maintaining the old forms of neighborliness. In truth, he felt the same reluctance, the same desire to pull back, to simplify their world to just their own four walls and their own careful calculations. It felt safer somehow, even though he knew intellectually that isolation was its own kind of danger. Another neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Albright, who lived with her grown son to the east, had been borrowing items regularly since December: a cup of flour here, some beans there, needles and thread, candles. Always small amounts, always returned or repaid eventually, but the frequency troubled Thomas. He began to suspect, though he didn't write it directly, that Mrs. Albright's stores had run dangerously low, that she was piecing together survival through these small borrowings rather than admitting the larger problem. If he was right, then at some point she would need help beyond what these incremental loans could provide. What would happen then? Would all the neighbors be expected to contribute to sustaining the Albright household through the rest of winter? Thomas didn't know, and the not knowing weighed on him. He found himself avoiding Mrs. Albright, taking different paths for his wood gathering, timing his outdoor work to minimize the chances of encountering her. This avoidance shamed him even as he couldn't quite stop doing it. He'd been raised to help widows, to look after those less able to care for themselves, but winter had made such charity feel dangerously complicated. In late February, a particularly severe storm trapped each family in their own cabin for nearly a week. The snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to mere feet, and the cold intensified to dangerous levels. Thomas spent those days close to the fire, rationing wood with painful precision, keeping his daughters entertained with stories and simple games, trying not to think about how the storm was consuming their stores while preventing any opportunity to replenish them. When it finally cleared, he ventured out to find the landscape transformed, drifts piled high against buildings and fences, paths completely erased, and smoke rising from only some of the distant cabins. The Albright place showed no smoke at all. Thomas stood in his doorway, looking across the white expanse at that silent chimney, and felt his stomach knot with dread and guilt in equal measure. The absence of smoke could mean many things. Perhaps they were fine but conserving fuel. Perhaps they'd gone to stay with the son's wife's family further north. Perhaps they were simply sleeping late. But it could also mean something worse. It could mean they'd run out of wood, or that someone was ill, or that they needed help they couldn't ask for. Thomas stood there for long minutes, torn between the impulse to check on them and the desire to believe everything was fine. Catherine came to stand beside him, following his gaze. "Someone should go see," she said quietly, not offering to go herself, not quite insisting that he should, just stating the fact that someone ought to. Thomas knew she was right. He knew that neighborly duty, human decency, simple compassion all demanded that he walk that half-mile through the deep snow and make certain the Albrights were well. But he also knew that going might mean discovering a problem he couldn't solve, might mean taking on an obligation his family couldn't bear, might mean choosing between his family's welfare and another's in ways that would haunt him regardless of what he decided. So he stood in the doorway, paralyzed by competing moral weights, while the smokeless chimney remained silent in the distance. Eventually, he went inside without committing to action, telling himself he would decide after breakfast, after checking his own wood supply, after seeing how the day developed. These were delays, he knew, justifications for inaction, but he couldn't seem to move past them. By afternoon, smoke had appeared at the Albright place. Relief flooded through Thomas so powerfully it left him weak. He didn't have to make the difficult choice, didn't have to discover what he was or wasn't capable of when pressed to the limit. He could return to his own concerns with the comforting belief that everyone was managing, that no dramatic intervention was required. But the relief was mixed with something else, a recognition that he had failed some test of character, that he'd been prepared to ignore a neighbor's potential distress to avoid complicating his own survival. This recognition sat uneasily in his mind, another weight added to the accumulation of small moral failures winter seemed to demand. March arrived with no sign of thaw. The days grew minimally longer, but the cold remained intense, the snow still deep. Thomas's journal entries from this period are sparse, sometimes just a few words noting the date and the weather. The emotional energy required to reflect on his circumstances seemed beyond his capacity. Catherine had grown quiet as well, speaking only when necessary, managing the household with grim efficiency. The daughters, sensing the tension, had become subdued, playing their games in whispers, asking for nothing beyond what was offered. The cabin felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in, the ceiling low and oppressive. Thomas found himself stepping outside frequently just to breathe, even when there was no work that needed doing. On one of these aimless exits, he encountered Robert Pratt in the neutral territory between their properties. Both men seemed equally surprised by the meeting, equally uncertain how to navigate it. They exchanged the briefest of greetings, discussed the persistent winter with carefully neutral words, and then Robert did something unexpected. He mentioned, almost casually, that his family had some extra dried apples put by, asked if Thomas's daughters might enjoy a portion. The offer confused Thomas. Was this repayment for the salt pork an attempt to restore balance between the families? Or was it something else, a genuine gesture of kindness, or perhaps a strategic move to maintain good relations in case the Pratts needed something else later? Thomas found that he couldn't read Robert's intention, couldn't separate genuine goodwill from calculated advantage. He accepted the apples with thanks that felt inadequate, and when he brought them home, Catherine received them with an expression that mixed gratitude with suspicion. "Why now?" she asked, and Thomas had no answer. The apples were distributed to the children, who received them with delight disproportionate to the gift itself, not because the apples were particularly special, but because they represented something beyond the narrow routine of rationed survival. For a few minutes there was lightness in the cabin, almost approaching the normal happiness of family life. But after the children were asleep, Catherine returned to her question. What had motivated the gift? What did it mean? What might the Pratts expect in return? Thomas found himself defending Robert's motives without really believing his own defense, found himself arguing for a generosity he wasn't certain existed. The conversation went nowhere, resolved nothing, left both of them more tired than before. In his journal that night, Thomas wrote something that captured the essential tragedy of that winter. We have become people who cannot accept kindness without suspicion, cannot offer help without calculation. The cold has crept not just into our bones, but into the spaces between us, freezing what ought to flow freely. April finally brought signs of genuine thaw. The snow began to recede, revealing the muddy earth beneath. The temperature rose above freezing during daylight hours, and the sound of dripping water became constant, almost musical, after the long silence of winter. Thomas's stores were nearly exhausted. Another week would have brought genuine crisis, but the timing had held. They had survived. All the families had survived, at least in the immediate settlement. Word filtered through eventually about other places, other families who hadn't been so fortunate. Cabins found empty when neighbors finally checked, bodies discovered after the snow melted, stories of quiet tragedy that winter had concealed. But in Thomas's immediate circle, everyone had made it through. Yet the relief was complicated by something else, something Thomas struggled to name in his journal entries. The relationships between families had been fundamentally altered. Trust eroded in ways that wouldn't be easily repaired. When neighbors encountered each other now in the mud and early spring light, they were friendly enough, spoke of relief and gratitude for survival, even laughed about the hardships they'd endured. But underneath the surface pleasantries, there was something different, something careful. Thomas wrote about this in April, one of his last entries before the journal trails off into sparse, practical notes about planting and repair. "We are friends again," he wrote, "or we are pretending to be, which amounts to nearly the same thing in daily life. But we all know what winter revealed about us, about our capacity for kindness and its limits, about how quickly community dissolves when survival grows uncertain. We smile at each other now in the spring light, but we remember who hoarded and who shared, who helped and who hid, who we could trust and who we couldn't. Winter has ended, but what it taught us remains." The Pratts eventually moved away the following year, seeking land further west. Mrs. Albright's son took her to live with his wife's family, the cabin standing empty through another winter before someone new claimed it. Thomas and Catherine stayed, raised their daughters, lived what appeared from outside to be an ordinary frontier life. But between the lines of the few documents that survive, you can sense the weight of that winter, the knowledge it imparted, the way it changed how they understood the word neighbor. Because winter had taught them something that couldn't be unlearned, that proximity isn't the same as connection, that sharing space doesn't guarantee shared fate, that the people living just 300 yards away can be simultaneously essential and threatening, trusted and feared all at once. Now we drift into a different kind of territory, into the spaces where history becomes mystery, where the absence of records speaks as loudly as their presence. We turn to what archaeologists and historians have found when they've looked carefully at the material traces of frontier winters, not the grand narratives of settlement and expansion, but the quiet evidence of how people actually lived, what they actually feared, and what they chose not to write down. There exists in certain archives a peculiar category of letter, correspondence that begins warmly with the usual inquiries about health and harvest, and then trails into careful euphemism and loaded silence. These are letters written in late winter or early spring, letters that mention neighbors without quite explaining what happened between the writer and those neighbors, letters that reference difficulties and misunderstandings without providing details. One such letter, dated March 1804 and preserved in a county historical society in what is now Indiana, captures this quality perfectly. A woman named Sarah writes to her sister back east about the winter they've endured, describing the snow and cold with vivid detail, but when she mentions their nearest neighbors, her language becomes suddenly vague. "The Mitchells have kept mostly to themselves this winter," she writes, "and we have done the same, which I suppose is natural given the circumstances, though I cannot quite bring myself to explain those circumstances in a letter, as they are both too small to merit discussion and too significant to dismiss." What were those circumstances? The letter never clarifies. This is the pattern historians encounter repeatedly when studying frontier correspondence from winter months, a sense that something happened, something shifted, but the writers either couldn't or wouldn't articulate exactly what. The silence itself becomes a kind of evidence, testimony to experiences that felt too complicated, too shameful, or too commonplace to record. You find these ellipses throughout the documentary record, these moments where the pen hesitates and then moves on, leaving the reader centuries later to wonder what weight pressed down on that hesitation. Archaeological sites tell a parallel story through material remains. When researchers excavate frontier homestead sites, they sometimes find patterns that suggest isolation more profound than geography alone would explain. One cluster of cabins in western Pennsylvania, occupied during the late 18th century, shows an unusual feature. The trash middens, the places where families disposed of broken tools, food waste, and other refuse, are positioned in ways that suggest careful privacy. Rather than placing these areas in the most convenient locations relative to the cabins, families positioned them where they would be least visible to neighbors. Someone standing at a neighboring cabin would have had to walk considerably out of their way to see what another family was discarding. This might seem like a minor detail, but it speaks to a mentality where even garbage became information to be guarded, where the evidence of what you ate and what you broke and what you had to throw away was worth hiding from the people who lived closest to you. The archaeological signature of this behavior is unmistakable. Extra distance, awkward placement, inconvenient access, all in service of preventing observation. Other sites show evidence of storage practices that suggest similar concerns. Root cellars and cache pits, underground storage for food and supplies, appear in locations that prioritize concealment over convenience. Some are positioned inside cabins, beneath floorboards, requiring families to move furniture to access their stores. Others are hidden in tree lines or built into hillsides at surprising distances from the main dwelling. The extra labor this required, the daily inconvenience of accessing food stored hundreds of feet away rather than in an attached shed, suggests that families valued secrecy more than efficiency. They were willing to work harder, to make their own lives more difficult, to prevent neighbors from knowing exactly what resources they possessed. Why this secrecy? The records rarely state directly, but the implication hangs in the patterns themselves. Knowledge was risk, visibility was vulnerability, and winter intensified both. When you excavate these sites carefully, measuring distances and angles, plotting sight lines and calculating the effort required to maintain these arrangements, what emerges is a portrait of families who treated their nearest neighbors as potential threats. Not dramatic threats, not violence or theft in the night, but something more insidious, the threat of being known too well, of having your resources inventoried by eyes that might be desperate enough to covet them. There's a particular archaeological mystery that captures this dynamic in concentrated form. In several frontier regions, researchers have found what they call phantom cabins, foundations or structural remains that show evidence of occupation during autumn and early winter, but which appear to have been abandoned suddenly before spring. These aren't cabins that burned or collapsed. The abandonment appears deliberate, the structures left intact but empty, sometimes with possessions still inside. One such site in Ohio, excavated in the 1970s, revealed a cabin with tools still hanging on walls, a few pieces of furniture in place, but no signs of violent struggle or disaster. The family simply seems to have walked away one winter, leaving much of their life behind. Historians initially theorized that disease might explain these abandonments, or conflict with native peoples, or some natural disaster. But the pattern doesn't quite fit those explanations. Disease would leave bodies or evidence of burial. Conflict would show signs of destruction. Disaster would affect multiple structures simultaneously. Instead, these phantom cabins suggest something else. Families who, for reasons they never recorded, found it impossible to continue living where they were. Families who abandon not just their homes, but the entire social web of a settlement, walking away into winter, rather than remaining among neighbors who had become intolerable for reasons history can only guess at. The mystery deepens when you consider what walking away in winter meant. It wasn't simply difficult, it was potentially suicidal, a choice that put survival at immediate risk. What circumstances would make that risk preferable to staying? What had happened between neighbors to make isolation in the wilderness seem safer than remaining in a community? The archaeological record can't answer these questions directly, but it documents the choice being made, families disappearing into the snow-covered landscape, leaving behind the material evidence of lives they couldn't continue living. Sometimes these sites show signs of hurried packing, certain items removed while others remained, suggesting departure under pressure, a threshold crossed where staying one more day became impossible. Probate records and land deeds offer another angle on these winter mysteries. When researchers track property ownership through frontier regions, they find unusual patterns in transfer timing. There's a notable spike in land sales and property transfers in the springs following particularly harsh winters. Families who had been settled for years suddenly selling out, moving on, leaving behind improvements and established farms for new uncertainty elsewhere. The legal documents recording these transactions are typically spare, offering no explanation beyond the bare facts of sale and purchase. But reading between the lines, you can sense flight. Families leaving not because of economic opportunity elsewhere, but because something about their current situation had become untenable. Sometimes the sale prices suggest desperation, land going for well below its improved value, as if the sellers couldn't afford to wait for a better offer. Other times the timing is suggestive, sales concluded rapidly, paperwork rushed through in ways that suggest urgency. Oral histories collected in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, interviews with elderly people who had been children on the frontier, sometimes offer fragments of explanation. These interviews must be read carefully. Memory is unreliable, especially across decades, and people often reshape their past to fit present narratives. But certain themes recur with enough frequency to suggest underlying truth. Multiple interviews reference families that couldn't get along, troubles between neighbors, winter disagreements that never got resolved. One interview conducted in 1897 with a woman who had been a child in Kentucky in the early 1800s is particularly revealing. She describes how her family's relationship with their nearest neighbors deteriorated over a single winter, and then offers this observation. Folks don't understand that being neighbors wasn't always a good thing. Sometimes it was the hardest thing. Sometimes you'd have been better off with nobody close by at all. When pressed for specifics about what caused the problems between families, she becomes vague, saying only that it was the usual troubles, borrowing and lending, and nobody being quite satisfied with how things balanced out. The interviewer's notes indicate frustration at this vagueness, multiple attempts to get the woman to provide concrete incidents or clear explanations. This vagueness, this reluctance to specify, appears throughout the oral history record. People remembered that tensions existed, remembered that winters were particularly difficult socially, but the specific grievances had either been forgotten or were being deliberately withheld. Perhaps this reflects the oral history subject's own discomfort with the memories, an unwillingness to speak ill of the dead or to admit to behaviors they later regretted. Or perhaps it reflects something more fundamental, that the tensions themselves were so diffuse, so impossible to locate in any single incident, that they couldn't be easily narrated even by those who had lived through them. One man, interviewed in 1903 about his childhood in frontier Illinois, offered a metaphor that seems to capture something essential about these winter tensions. He said it was like living in a house with too many people and not enough rooms, where every movement disturbs someone else, where the simple act of existing becomes an imposition. Museum collections occasionally hold artifacts that carry traces of these social dynamics. A small historical society in Vermont preserves a butter churn with an unusual feature, a wooden lock fitted to prevent the lid from being opened without a key. The churn dates to the early 19th century and came from a frontier household. Why would anyone fit a lock to a butter churn? The museum's documentation, drawn from family papers donated with the artifact, suggests that the lock was added after an incident where a neighbor had borrowed the churn and returned it with less butter than the owners believed they'd lent. The lock was both practical protection and symbolic statement. Trust had been withdrawn, replaced by physical barriers. What makes this artifact particularly poignant is its craftsmanship. The lock is carefully fitted, obviously the work of someone who spent significant time and effort on this modification. The labor invested in securing a butter churn speaks volumes about the weight of the grievance, the depth of the mistrust. Other collections include account books and tallies, small notebooks where frontier families recorded debts and credits between themselves and their neighbors. These ledgers are remarkable for their precision and their emotional weight. Every borrowed item is listed, every favor noted, every exchange recorded with careful detail. The cumulative effect is claustrophobic, relationships reduced to accounting, friendship replaced by balanced books, community transformed into a system of debts that could never quite be settled because survival itself was always uncertain. Some of these account books show evidence of revision, numbers crossed out and rewritten, calculations performed and reperformed in margins. You can almost feel the anxiety in those corrections, the desperate need to get the math right, because getting it wrong might mean the difference between surviving winter and not. One particularly poignant example held in a museum in upstate New York shows increasingly frantic calculation as the entries progress through winter. The handwriting grows more cramped, the numbers smaller and tighter, as if the physical space on the page was shrinking along with the writer's resources. The final entry is dated late February and simply reads, "Cannot continue this reckoning, must trust or must not, the middle way exhausts beyond bearing." After that, blank pages. The family apparently gave up trying to track the complex web of mutual obligation, unable to sustain the mental and emotional burden it required. What happened after that final entry is impossible to know. Did trust replace accounting, or did the relationship with neighbors simply end? Material culture studies reveal other patterns that speak to winter isolation and social fragmentation. Textile analysis shows that frontier families produced an unusually high proportion of their own clothing and household textiles, even when purchasing such items would have been more economical. This suggests a desire for self-sufficiency that went beyond practical necessity, a reluctance to be indebted even for items that could easily be bought or traded. Every piece of homespun cloth, every laboriously sewn garment represented independence maintained, obligation avoided, separation preserved. The quality of these homemade textiles varies widely. Some show skilled workmanship, while others are crude and barely functional. But both types appear in contexts that suggest continued use long after replacement would have been sensible. Ceramic analysis reveals similar patterns. Frontier households used dishes and vessels that were often mismatched, assembled from whatever was available rather than purchased as sets. But they used them for decades, repairing breaks with careful rivets, continuing to use pieces that were barely functional rather than borrowing or trading for replacements. The message in these worn, broken, carefully mended objects is clear. Better to make do with what you have than to owe anything to anyone. Some of these ceramic repairs show remarkable persistence, bowls held together by multiple rivets, plates with more metal than original material remaining, cups so heavily mended they must have been nearly impossible to use without cutting oneself on the rough repairs. Yet families kept using them, kept repairing them, rather than enter into the social obligations that acquiring replacements would have required. Architectural historians have noted features in frontier cabin construction that suggest privacy concerns unusual for the period. Windows positioned to limit sight lines to neighboring cabins, doors placed to minimize visibility of the interior from outside, even the orientation of buildings calculated to reduce casual observation. These weren't defensive fortifications against external threats. They were protections against something more intimate: the gaze of neighbors, the visibility of daily life, the risk of being known too well by people you depended on but couldn't fully trust. In some cases, families added interior partitions or screens that served no practical purpose except to prevent anyone entering the cabin from immediately seeing the entire living space. These modifications took time and materials, resources that were scarce, suggesting that privacy was worth considerable investment. The most haunting evidence comes from graveyards, not from what's there, but from what's missing. Frontier cemeteries often show family plots that are strangely isolated, individual stones set far apart even when space was not a constraint. This physical distance between burials mirrors the social distance that had developed in life, families maintaining separation even in death, reluctant to lie beside those they'd lived beside but grown apart from during those long winter months. Some cemeteries show this pattern so clearly it's almost geometric. Families who lived as neighbors buried in plots separated by precise, measured distances. Some graves bear inscriptions that hint at the emotional landscape of frontier life. One stone in a nearly forgotten cemetery in Missouri reads simply, "Here lies Margaret Thorne, who trusted in Providence more than people and was not disappointed." The inscription seems to capture something essential: a turning away from human community towards something more reliable, even if that meant accepting loneliness as the price of avoiding betrayal. Other stones carry similar messages, often oblique, but recognizable once you know what to look for. References to self-reliance, to divine rather than human support, to peace found in solitude. Historical demographers have found patterns in birth records that correlate with winter severity. The harshest winters show marked decreases in conceptions, not just during winter itself, but in the months following. This suggests that winter's impact extended beyond immediate survival, affecting families' willingness to bring new life into situations where resources were uncertain and community support could not be relied upon. The demographic shadows cast by winter lasted into the following year, into the seasons when life should have been resuming its normal rhythms. The pattern is particularly striking when you compare it with later periods. Once communities were more established, once infrastructure improved and trade networks developed, the correlation between winter severity and conception rates diminishes. This suggests the effect was specifically tied to frontier isolation and the breakdown of social support systems under winter pressure. Church records, where they exist, show attendance patterns that reflect winter's social impact. In settlements with churches or meeting houses, attendance often dropped dramatically during winter and failed to recover fully even when weather improved. Ministers' notes and letters reference continued divisions, breaches not yet healed, congregations diminished by discord. The spiritual community had been fractured along with the social one, winter's tensions infecting even the space that was supposed to transcend earthly concerns. One minister in Western Virginia wrote in his journal about conducting separate services for families who refused to worship together, essentially doubling his workload to accommodate feuds that the parties involved couldn't or wouldn't explain. His frustration is palpable in the entries, but so is his recognition that forcing reconciliation was impossible. Whatever had happened during winter had created divisions too deep for simple mediation. Legal records occasionally capture the aftermath of winter disputes, though they do so indirectly. Court cases filed in spring and summer sometimes reference events that occurred during winter, conflicts over borrowed property not returned, disputes about debts incurred when one family aided another. What's striking about these cases is how many were eventually dropped or settled quietly. Parties who had been willing to file legal complaints seemed to lose their appetite for public airing of grievances once the immediate crisis of winter had passed. This suggests that the conflicts themselves were recognized as products of extreme circumstances, disputes that felt urgent in January but embarrassing or petty by May. But the fact that they were filed at all indicates how seriously these winter tensions were felt in the moment, how ready people were to transform neighborly disagreements into formal legal battles. The legal language in these cases often struggles to capture the nature of the grievances, formal charges about property or debt that seem to stand in for deeper, less articulable resentments. Reading these documents, you sense the inadequacy of legal frameworks for addressing what were fundamentally crises of relationship, rather than clear violations of law. Archaeological surveys of frontier landscapes reveal patterns of abandonment that correlate with winter severity. Areas that experienced consecutive harsh winters show higher rates of property abandonment, families giving up on locations that were perfectly viable in terms of land quality and resources. The land wasn't the problem, the social environment created by winter hardship was. Families couldn't sustain the psychological weight of living in close proximity to people they'd grown to fear or resent, even when leaving meant starting over from nothing. Survey data shows that these abandonments often happened in clusters. Once one family left, others followed within a year or two, as if the departure of one household destabilized the entire settlement. The remaining families, already strained by winter tensions, couldn't maintain the fiction of community once someone had openly acknowledged it was unbearable. Museum archives contain letters that were never sent, drafts and fragments found among family papers after death. Some of these unsent letters are addressed to neighbors, attempts to explain or apologize or justify actions taken during winter. The fact that they were never sent suggests how difficult it was to articulate the complex emotions involved, how inadequate words felt when trying to capture the mixture of guilt, resentment, fear, and shame that winter relationships produced. These drafts often show multiple attempts to find the right phrasing, sentences crossed out and rewritten, whole paragraphs abandoned mid-thought. One such unsent letter, dated March 1811, begins, "Dear Mrs. Richardson, I hope you will understand that what happened this winter was not from malice but from necessity, though I confess the line between those two has become blurred in my mind." The letter continues for several paragraphs, circling around an incident it never quite describes before ending mid-sentence, as if the writer gave up trying to make the explanation make sense. The fact that it was preserved suggests it meant something to the writer, even if they couldn't bring themselves to send it. Perhaps it served as a kind of confession, an acknowledgement to themselves, if not to their neighbor, of guilt or regret, or simply the recognition that winter had revealed something about themselves they wished they could deny. Historical climate data helps frame these social patterns. The late 18th and early 19th centuries included what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a period of colder than average temperatures that made winters particularly severe in North America. Tree ring data shows growing seasons shortened, snow accumulation increased, and spring arrivals delayed compared to previous centuries. This wasn't just perception. Winters genuinely were harder during the frontier period than they'd been in earlier times or would be in later ones. This climatic context helps explain why winter tensions appear so frequently in frontier records. These communities were experiencing weather at the extreme end of what human settlement could endure, conditions that tested every social bond and revealed every vulnerability in the networks of trust that held communities together. The tree ring record also shows year-to-year variation in winter severity, and when you correlate this with the documentary record, the patterns align remarkably well. The winters that show the most extreme growth suppression in trees are the same winters that show up in letters, court records, and property transfers as times of particular social stress. Nature's Archive and Humanities Archive tell the same story. Archaeological evidence from hearths and fireplaces shows patterns of fuel consumption that suggest families were burning inadequate amounts of wood, keeping fires lower than comfort or safety required. This wasn't because fuel was unavailable. The frontier was heavily forested. It suggests instead that gathering adequate firewood required entering territory that brought families into contact with neighbors, crossing sight lines, being visible in ways that felt risky or uncomfortable. Some families apparently chose cold over exposure, accepting physical discomfort to maintain social distance. Analysis of charcoal and ash deposits shows that some families were burning wood that was green or wet, less efficient, and producing less heat, rather than accessing the properly seasoned wood that would have required venturing into shared woodlots or areas closer to other cabins. The physical evidence of cold winters made worse by social anxiety is written in these ash layers, in the inefficient burns and inadequate heat. Documentary evidence supports this archaeological pattern. Several diaries mention fires kept lower than usual, or fires banked early in the evening, with explanations that circle around but never quite state the social dimensions of fuel gathering. One diary entry from 1808 notes simply, "Kept the fire small today, though it was cold. Better to be cold than to be seen as taking more than our share from the common wood." The cumulative weight of this evidence, letters unwritten, words unsaid, graves isolated, accounts obsessively kept, cabins abandoned, trust withdrawn, creates a picture of frontier life that differs significantly from the communal, barn-raising mythology that dominates popular imagination. That mythology isn't entirely false. Barn raisings did happen, communities did sometimes come together in ways that were genuinely cooperative and generous. What emerges instead is something more complex and more human. Communities held together by necessity but strained by proximity, people trying to be good neighbors while knowing that goodness had limits, families navigating the impossible balance between cooperation and self-preservation. The frontier experience contained both the communal ideal and its opposite, often simultaneously, often in ways that created unbearable psychological tension. Winter made all of this visible in ways that other seasons didn't. When resources were abundant and survival certain, people could afford generosity, could maintain the fiction of community solidarity. But winter stripped away the buffer that made generosity possible, revealed the calculations underlying every human interaction, forced people to acknowledge that their first loyalty was to their own survival and their own family, not to some abstract ideal of neighborly duty. What could be hidden in summer became unavoidable in winter, the fundamental conflict between self-preservation and community obligation. This is perhaps why the documentary record is so full of silences around these tensions. To articulate them fully would be to admit something about human nature that contradicted the ideals frontier communities were supposedly built on: self-reliance, cooperation, mutual aid, neighborly virtue. Winter revealed that these ideals could not all be maintained simultaneously when survival was uncertain, that choices had to be made, and that those choices often meant prioritizing one's own family over the community. The mystery that archaeologists and historians circle around, the question that all this evidence points toward but cannot definitively answer, is this: how common was this experience? Were the tensions documented in letters, preserved in artifacts, visible in settlement patterns representative of frontier life generally, or were they exceptional cases, unusual failures in systems that mostly worked? The silence in the historical record cuts both ways. The lack of detailed accounts of winter conflicts could mean such conflicts were rare, hardly worth mentioning. Or it could mean they were so common, so universally understood, that no one felt the need to explain them, like complaining about the weather, too obvious to warrant documentation. The mystery persists because the very people who could have answered the question chose not to, leaving behind only traces and shadows for later generations to interpret. Methodologically, this presents a profound challenge for historians. How do you measure something that people actively avoided documenting? How do you quantify silence, calculate the weight of what was deliberately not said? Statistical analysis can show correlations between winter severity and property abandonment, between harsh weather and decreased church attendance, between deep snows and spring migrations. But correlation doesn't capture the lived experience, the daily accumulation of small resentments and fears that made those statistics possible. Comparative studies with other frontier regions show interesting variations. Canadian frontier settlements in similar climatic conditions show some of the same patterns, but generally less evidence of extreme social fracture. This might reflect different settlement patterns. Canadian frontiers often had stronger institutional support, more government presence, different property arrangements, or it might reflect different cultural attitudes toward community and individualism, different expectations about what neighbors owed each other. The question of whether winter's social impact was universal or culturally specific remains open, another layer of mystery in an already mysterious archive. What is clear is that winter on the frontier was not just a physical challenge but a social and psychological one. It tested not just bodies but relationships, not just resources but trust. And it left behind a legacy encoded in objects and sites and documents, a record of how proximity can become burden, how community can fragment, how the people living closest to you can become the ones you trust least. This is the archaeology of silence, the material culture of mistrust, the permanent record of what winter revealed about the fragility of human bonds when survival stops being guaranteed. The implications extend beyond the historical record. These frontier winters offer a kind of natural experiment in social dynamics under stress. What happens to communities when the margin between sufficiency and crisis narrows to almost nothing? When every decision carries existential weight, when the difference between your survival and your neighbors might come down to a single bushel of corn or cord of wood. Modern societies have largely insulated themselves from these dynamics through infrastructure, through social safety nets, through systems of exchange that don't require face-to-face negotiation of every transaction. But the frontier experience suggests that beneath those insulations, the same tensions remain latent, the fundamental incompatibility between genuine community and the calculation of self-interest. Perhaps what makes the frontier evidence so haunting is not that it reveals something unusual about that time and place, but that it reveals something universal about human social organization under pressure. The silences in the archive may be silences about something people recognized but couldn't bear to state openly, that community is always contingent, always dependent on conditions that cannot be guaranteed, always threatened by the very proximity it requires. The archaeological record will continue to yield more evidence as excavation techniques improve and researchers ask new questions. Isotope analysis of bones from frontier cemeteries might reveal nutritional stress patterns that correlate with social isolation. Advanced remote sensing might identify more phantom cabins, more evidence of abandonment. But the central mystery, what exactly happened during those winters, what words were spoken or left unsaid, what specific incidents transformed neighbors into strangers, will likely remain opaque. The people who lived through it chose silence, and that silence has become as much a part of the historical record as any artifact or document. In the end, we're left with fragments and implications, with patterns that suggest without proving, with silences that speak without quite saying what they mean. The archaeology of frontier winters gives us a map of where the tensions were, but not always why they emerged or how they felt to those who experienced them. It's a history written in negative space, in what was carefully not said, in arrangements and behaviors that make sense only when you understand the fears and calculations they were responding to. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some historical experiences resist full articulation, remain forever in the realm of implication and suggestion, preserved not in clear statement but in the careful architecture of avoidance that surrounds them. What winter revealed about frontier life was this: that human society at its most basic level is a negotiation between competing imperatives, the need for cooperation and the need for self-preservation, the desire for community and the fear of vulnerability, the comfort of proximity and the burden of obligation. When conditions were favorable, that negotiation could produce something that looked and felt like genuine community, like mutual support and neighborly care. But when winter came, when margins tightened and stakes rose, the negotiation became explicit, the calculations visible, and what emerged was often something quite different from the communal ideal, a system of careful accounting, strategic withdrawal, and maintained distance, all in service of a survival that was recognized as fundamentally individual, even when it required occasional cooperation with others. This is what the archaeological record preserves, not the failure of frontier communities, but their success at a different, harder task than the mythology suggests. These were communities that survived by learning to balance proximity with distance, cooperation with independence, trust with self-protection. The evidence of that balance, the locked butter churns, the hidden root cellars, the carefully positioned middens, is the real achievement, the genuine accomplishment of frontier life. It wasn't the achievement of creating perfect community in the wilderness. It was the achievement of survival in conditions that made perfect community impossible, the creation of something that worked, even if it didn't match the ideal, even if it left scars and silences that would perplex later generations, trying to understand what had been endured and what had been lost in the enduring. Let us turn now from isolated cabins to a different world entirely, one that existed just miles away, but might as well have been on another continent for all the difference it made in how winter was experienced. We drift toward the forts, the trading posts, the mission stations, places where winter was still difficult, still dangerous, still long, but where the burden of survival was distributed across institutional structures rather than falling entirely on individual families. These were the places where a different kind of frontier life unfolded, where hierarchy and collective organization provided buffers against the isolation and mistrust that plagued scattered homesteaders. Not luxury, not ease, but something perhaps more valuable: the absence of certain fears, the relief of not having to calculate every interaction with the mathematics of survival. Fort Duquesne, Fort Detroit, Fort Michilimackinac, names that carried weight in the frontier imagination, places that represented stability and supply in a landscape of uncertainty. Inside their walls lived soldiers, traders, craftsmen, interpreters, and the families attached to these roles. These people experienced winter differently, not because they were wealthy, many were quite poor by any objective measure, but because their survival was a collective responsibility rather than an individual burden. The fort commander's duty included ensuring his garrison had adequate food and fuel, not from personal generosity, but from institutional obligation. This meant that the soldiers enduring a winter at Fort Niagara in 1780 didn't need to count their portions against their neighbors' portions, didn't need to wonder if borrowing from the communal stores would create personal debt to individuals they couldn't repay. The stores belonged to the institution, not to any particular person, which transformed the social mathematics of survival entirely. A soldier might resent his commanding officer for short rations, might complain about the quality or quantity of food provided, but he didn't owe that officer personal debt. The relationship remained professional, defined by military hierarchy rather than personal obligation. This distinction, subtle as it might seem, changed everything about how winter was experienced socially. When spring came, soldiers didn't carry the weight of knowing exactly who had helped them survive and what implicit debt that help created. The psychological freedom this provided cannot be overstated. It meant that men could endure hardship without the additional burden of tracking favors received and obligations incurred. It meant that hunger was just hunger, not hunger, complicated by the awareness that accepting food meant entering into social contracts whose terms remained forever unclear. Trading posts operated on similar principles, though with commercial rather than military logic. The Hudson's Bay Company posts scattered across the northern frontier, the American Fur Company stations along major waterways. These were economic enterprises that understood winter survival as a business necessity. Post factors, the men who managed these remote trading stations, kept detailed records of provisions distributed to employees and the voyageurs who transported furs and supplies. These records show a kind of institutional care that had nothing to do with personal affection and everything to do with maintaining a functioning commercial operation. A factor at a Hudson's Bay post in the winter of 1795 notes in his ledger the distribution of pemmican, dried fish, flour, and tea to the men under his authority. The quantities are carefully recorded, the timing regular, the distribution equitable according to rank and role. What's absent from these records is any sense of personal favor or obligation. The men received these provisions because the company had agreed to provide them as part of their employment, because the company needed healthy workers to resume operations when winter ended. This transformed winter from a test of personal relationships into a matter of institutional reliability. Men might complain about the company's stinginess or the quality of provisions, but they complained as employees about an employer, not as individuals locked in complex webs of mutual debt with other individuals. The complaints themselves took on a different character. They could be voiced openly, collectively even, without fear that expressing dissatisfaction would sever relationships upon which survival depended. A voyageur could grumble about the factor's decisions to his fellows without worrying that such grumbling would mark him as ungrateful or unreliable in ways that would haunt him when he needed help. Mission stations represented yet another model of collective winter survival. Catholic missions in the Great Lakes region, Moravian missions in Pennsylvania and Ohio, Methodist and Baptist missions throughout the frontier, these places gathered small communities around religious purpose and shared faith. Missionaries kept detailed journals and correspondence that document winter life inside these communities. What emerges from these records is a picture of hardship, certainly, but hardship experienced communally in ways that distributed both material burden and emotional weight. A Jesuit missionary writing from a mission station on Lake Superior in the winter of 1798 describes the daily routine of communal meals, shared worship, collective work, maintaining the mission buildings, and tending to livestock. The language he uses emphasizes unity and shared purpose even as he acknowledges the severity of conditions. "We are all hungry together," he writes, "all cold together, all weary of winter together, but we face these trials as a community bound by faith, not as individuals calculating advantage against one another." Whether this religious framing actually eliminated the tensions that plagued isolated homesteaders is difficult to know. Missionary accounts are not objective records, but documents shaped by institutional and spiritual purposes. But the very fact that missionaries felt confident describing communal harmony suggests their experience differed meaningfully from the fragmented, mistrustful world of scattered cabins. The religious vocabulary itself provided a framework for understanding hardship that reduced its social toxicity. Suffering could be interpreted as spiritual trial, as test of faith, as opportunity for collective devotion, rather than as evidence of personal failure or as occasion for resentment against those who suffered less. The material conditions at forts and posts were often hardly better than those at isolated homesteads. Quarters were cramped, food monotonous, fuel carefully rationed, medical care minimal. A soldier at Fort Pitt in the winter of 1802 might have eaten the same salt pork and cornmeal as a nearby homesteader, might have slept in equally cold conditions, might have suffered the same ailments and discomforts. But he experienced these hardships differently because they were shared with dozens or hundreds of others, because suffering was normalized rather than isolating, because hardship was a collective condition rather than a personal failure. The very visibility of shared suffering mattered immensely. When everyone was cold, when everyone's rations were short, when everyone was sick of salt pork and cornmeal, no individual had to wonder whether their own struggle indicated some personal inadequacy or attracted the silent judgment of neighbors. The social life of these institutional spaces followed patterns that reduced the kind of intimate tension that developed between isolated neighbors. Military hierarchy, company regulations, religious authority, these structures created social distance that paradoxically made interaction easier. A private soldier didn't need to worry about whether the sergeant was silently judging his consumption of firewood, didn't need to calculate whether asking for an extra blanket would create debt or resentment. The sergeant's role was to manage such resources, the private's role was to obey orders, and the relationship remained within those bounds. This clarity of roles and expectations provided enormous psychological relief. Men knew what was expected of them, knew the limits of their obligations, knew that their relationships would be governed by institutional rules rather than by the murky, ever-shifting terrain of personal reciprocity. Fort Commandant's correspondence reveals their understanding of winter management as primarily a logistics problem. A captain writing from Fort Mackinac in December 1805 discusses his calculations about food stores, his concerns about fuel supplies, his plans for maintaining discipline and morale during the long months of confinement. What's notably absent from such correspondence is any anxiety about managing personal relationships with those under his command. He worried about the garrison as a collective, about mutiny or mass dissatisfaction, but not about the intricate individual bonds of trust and obligation that consumed the attention of isolated homesteaders. This wasn't because fort commandants were unconcerned with their men's welfare. Many took their responsibilities seriously and worked hard to ensure adequate provision. But the institutional framework meant their care was administrative rather than personal, structured by duty rather than shaped by the complex reciprocities of neighborly aid. A commandant could care about his men in the abstract, could work to improve their conditions, could advocate for better supplies from distant authorities, all without entering into the kind of personal entanglements that made relationships between homesteaders so fraught. His obligation was to the institution and to military duty, not to specific individuals whose needs might conflict or whose gratitude might become burden. The trading post factor faced similar dynamics. His journals from winter months focus on inventory management, on calculating whether stores will last until spring supply routes reopen, on maintaining discipline among men who grow restless in confinement. He notes disputes and conflicts certainly. Men living in close quarters through long winters inevitably grated on one another. But these disputes were handled through company rules and hierarchical authority, not through the informal, fraught negotiations that governed relations between frontier neighbors. When two voyageurs quarreled at a Hudson's Bay post over some perceived slight, the factor could impose a solution through his authority as company representative. The men might resent his decision, but the conflict was contained within a framework that prevented it from metastasizing into the kind of lasting, corrosive mistrust that developed between homesteaders. The resolution didn't require the parties to genuinely forgive each other or to rebuild trust. It only required them to obey the imposed solution and continue functioning within the organizational structure. This was a lower bar than genuine reconciliation, but it sufficed to keep winter from destroying the social fabric entirely. Mission stations operated through religious authority that served similar functions. When conflicts arose between members of a mission community, and correspondence makes clear they did arise, missionaries could invoke spiritual obligation and divine authority to mediate disputes. A Moravian missionary's journal from Pennsylvania in the winter of 1799 describes a disagreement between two families living at the mission over the distribution of firewood. The missionary intervened, made a decision based on stated principles of Christian charity and fairness, and both families accepted his judgment because to do otherwise would be to challenge not just his personal authority, but the religious framework that bound the community together. Whether this really resolved the underlying tensions or simply suppressed them is another question, but it provided a mechanism for conflict resolution that isolated homesteaders lacked, a way to externalize decisions so they didn't become personal affronts between individuals who would have to continue living near each other. The appeal to higher principles, whether military regulations, company policy, or divine will, meant that decisions could be framed as impersonal, as applications of external standards rather than as expressions of personal preference or favoritism. This removed some of the sting from outcomes that disadvantaged particular individuals. The physical layout of these institutional spaces also shaped social dynamics in important ways. Forts were designed around communal spaces, parade grounds, common buildings, shared mess facilities. This meant that much of daily life unfolded in view of others, normalized by collective participation. Eating became a group activity rather than a private, carefully rationed family affair. Work was organized collectively rather than managed individually. Even leisure time was often spent in company rather than in isolated cabins. This visibility could be oppressive in its own way. Soldiers complained about the lack of privacy, about constant oversight, about never being able to escape the presence of others. But it also meant that no one had to endure winter alone, that hardship was witnessed and shared rather than hidden and borne in silence. The psychological difference between suffering in isolation and suffering in company should not be minimized. Isolation amplifies every hardship. Every difficulty feel more significant, more permanent, more indicative of personal failure. Trading posts similarly organized around collective spaces. The main hall or trading room became a gathering place during winter months when weather prevented travel, a space where men told stories, played cards, argued about politics or theology or trivia, anything to pass the long, dark hours. These gatherings served functions beyond entertainment. They maintained social bonds, reminded individuals they were part of a collective, provided witnesses to each person's conduct that could confirm their good faith participation in communal life. A voyageur who shared his tobacco, who participated in group activities, who pulled his weight in collective tasks was building a reputation that mattered within the post community. But this reputation was earned through visible, public actions rather than through the hidden, uncertain calculus of private favors between neighbors. The public nature of reputation building made it more stable and predictable than the reputation dynamics between isolated homesteaders. A man knew where he stood because he could observe how others treated him in communal settings, could gauge his standing through visible social interactions rather than through the subtle signs and silences that constituted communication between distant neighbors. Mission communities similarly emphasized collective activity, communal worship, shared meals when possible, cooperative work on mission projects. Missionaries deliberately organized life to reinforce community bonds, understanding that isolation threatened not just physical survival but spiritual well-being. The theological framing of collective life as religious duty added weight to communal obligations. Participating in shared activities wasn't just practical necessity or social preference, it was spiritual requirement, making non-participation more difficult to justify or sustain. The contrast with scattered homesteaders becomes stark when you consider what each group worried about during winter. A soldier at a fort worried about discipline, about conflicts with fellow soldiers in close quarters, about disease spreading through crowded barracks, about the adequacy of provisions provided by the institution. But he didn't worry about whether his survival depended on maintaining good relations with specific individuals who might or might not choose to help him when help was needed. His survival was institutional, impersonal, guaranteed by structures larger than any individual relationship. This meant his social anxieties, while real, were of a different order than those experienced by homesteaders. He might worry about being liked, about fitting in, about avoiding conflicts that would make daily life unpleasant, but these were concerns about quality of life rather than about survival itself. A homesteader worried about all the physical threats that winter brought, but also about the social calculations that determined whether he could borrow tools or food when his own stores ran short, whether neighbors would come if he called for help, whether the community would sustain his family if something happened to him. These worries were deeply personal, tied to specific individuals and specific relationships, impossible to resolve through appeal to authority or institutional obligation. The homesteader's winter was psychologically different, not because it was physically harder, but because its hardships were entangled with the complex, uncertain terrain of human relationships. Every interaction carried weight, every exchange had to be calculated against future needs, every favor received became potential debt that might be called due at unpredictable times. The mental burden of this constant calculation, this endless social accounting, was exhausting in ways that physical labor never quite captured. Elite members of frontier society, officers rather than enlisted men, post factors rather than common laborers, missionaries rather than mission residents, experienced yet another gradation of winter privilege. Not material luxury by the standards of eastern cities, but certain critical protections that made all the difference. A fort commandant typically had private quarters, sometimes heated more adequately than common barracks. He had access to better food, whether through official provisions allocated by rank or through ability to purchase supplies from traders. More importantly, he had authority that insulated him from certain forms of dependence. When he needed something, he could order it rather than request it, could command rather than ask, could enforce rather than negotiate. This didn't make him immune to winter's difficulties. Illness could strike officers as readily as common soldiers, cold affected everyone, isolation was psychologically difficult regardless of rank. But it buffered him from the specific anxiety of dependence on equals, the fear that asking for help would create obligations he couldn't discharge. The power to command meant never having to place oneself in another's debt, never having to wonder whether help would be given or what it would cost. This was perhaps the most fundamental form of winter privilege, freedom from the social accounting that consumed those who depended on approximate equals. Trading post factors occupied a similar position. They managed resources rather than scrambling for them, made decisions about distribution rather than hoping to be included in distribution, maintained authority that protected them from the vulnerability that defined life for those below them in the hierarchy. Their journals and correspondence from winter months reflect concerns about responsibility, worry about whether they were managing resources wisely, whether their decisions would be judged sound by distant company directors, whether they were maintaining order effectively. These were significant stresses, but they were professional stresses, not the intimate, personal anxieties that consumed isolated homesteaders. A factor worried about whether he would be held accountable for shortages or waste, whether his management would be judged competent by superiors who might review his records months later. But he didn't worry about whether the men under his authority would remember his decisions as favors requiring repayment, didn't calculate whether distributing extra provisions to one voyageur would create expectations he couldn't meet or resentments he couldn't manage. Missionaries occupied a more complex position. Most had chosen relative poverty and hardship for spiritual reasons, and many endured genuine deprivation alongside those they served. But they also possessed forms of capital that provided crucial protection. They were literate, connected to larger institutional networks that could provide support, often had access to small funds or supplies from religious organizations in the East. They might go hungry, but they rarely faced the absolute uncertainty that plagued frontier families with no external connections. The knowledge that they could, in extremity, appeal to distant religious authorities for assistance provided psychological security even when material conditions were dire. Perhaps more importantly, their role as spiritual authorities gave them status that transcended material conditions. A missionary might have less food than some of those he served, but his position commanded respect that couldn't be easily revoked, authority that didn't depend on maintaining complex reciprocal relationships. This authority was institutional rather than personal. It derived from the missionary's role, from his connection to religious structures and sacred purposes, not from his individual wealth or generosity. This meant it couldn't be undermined by the kinds of failures or shortcomings that destroyed personal authority between frontier neighbors. The wealthy fur traders who visited frontier posts but maintained homes in Montreal or Quebec or St. Louis represented the furthest extreme of winter privilege. These men experienced frontier winters as temporary adventures or business necessities rather than as tests of survival. They traveled with supplies, with servants, with resources that made them essentially tourists in landscapes that were life and death arenas for others. Their accounts of frontier winters, preserved in letters and memoirs, often emphasize the picturesque or exotic aspects of the experience while remaining remarkably oblivious to the psychological pressures that shaped life for permanent residents. One such account, written by a Montreal merchant describing a winter spent at a Lake Superior trading post in 1788, marvels at the beauty of snow-covered forests, praises the heartiness of the voyageurs, and expresses satisfaction at profitable trading conducted during his visit. What's absent is any recognition of the difference his wealth and mobility made, any acknowledgement that he was visiting a world whose rules didn't apply to him because he could leave whenever he chose, could return to comfort and security that remained permanently out of reach for most frontier inhabitants. His appreciation of winter's beauty reveals his distance from winter's danger. Only those who are insulated from genuine threat can afford to aestheticize hardship, to find picturesque what others experience as terror. The gap between his perspective and that of permanent frontier residents measures exactly the protection his privilege provided. Military officers visiting from eastern posts sometimes wrote with similar blind spots. They noted the hardships of frontier service, expressed sympathy for soldiers enduring difficult conditions, recommended improvements in provisions or shelter. But their reports rarely grasped the psychological dimensions of frontier isolation, the way that distance from authority and institutions fundamentally changed how people related to each other. They saw physical hardship but missed the social and emotional strain that made physical hardship unbearable. Their recommendations focused on tangible improvements, better barracks, more adequate rations, regular rotation of troops to prevent extended frontier service. These were valuable suggestions, but they addressed only the material dimension of frontier difficulty while missing the deeper psychological challenge of maintaining human connection under conditions that made trust dangerous. The records left by these elite visitors are valuable for what they document about material conditions, about the physical landscape and weather patterns, about the logistics of frontier life. But they're limited by their author's inability to fully comprehend what winter meant for those who couldn't escape it. Reading these accounts creates a strange doubled perspective. We see the frontier through eyes that observed accurately but understood incompletely, that noted details without grasping their significance. The letters and journals contain information their authors didn't fully appreciate, patterns they documented without recognizing. Government officials posted to frontier regions occupied another category of relative privilege. Indian agents, territorial administrators, judges and magistrates, these men had salaries, official status, often some access to supplies through government channels. They experienced frontier life as a form of service, sometimes unwelcome service, but still as something temporary and professionally defined rather than as permanent condition. Winter for them was a period to be endured until they could return to civilization, not a recurring test of survival and social relationships. Their correspondence back to Eastern authorities often complained about frontier conditions, requested transfers or additional resources, expressed dissatisfaction with the hardships of their posts. But these complaints came from a position of institutional belonging that made all the difference. They weren't isolated individuals hoping neighbors would help them survive. They were representatives of distant authority, connected to power structures that provided identity and security even when material conditions were difficult. The psychological protection this provided shouldn't be underestimated. Knowing that one served a larger institution, that one's role was recognized and valued by distant authorities, that one would eventually return to more comfortable circumstances. This knowledge buffered against the despair and isolation that could overwhelm those who saw no end to frontier hardship, no escape from its demands. Women's experiences within these institutional settings deserve particular attention. Military wives, fur traders' wives, missionaries' wives, these women lived within the same institutional frameworks as their husbands, but often experienced winter quite differently. They bore primary responsibility for household management, for making inadequate resources stretch, for maintaining domestic routine in circumstances that made routine nearly impossible. Their letters and journals from frontier winters often reveal stresses and anxieties that their husbands' accounts don't acknowledge. A captain's wife writing from Fort Dearborn in the winter of 1808 describes the challenge of feeding her family on military rations, of keeping children warm and occupied during months of confinement, of managing relationships with other officers' wives in close quarters where every slight became magnified. She had advantages over isolated homesteading women, more resources, more security, more social support. But she also faced pressures particular to her position, the need to maintain genteel standards in conditions that made such standards nearly impossible, the requirement to support her husband's authority while managing her own frustrations and fears, the expectation that officers' wives would maintain social hierarchies and proper behavior even in frontier hardship added psychological burden to material difficulty. A captain's wife couldn't simply focus on survival, she had to survive while preserving appearances, while modeling appropriate conduct, while managing social relationships that reflected on her husband's position. Native women who lived at trading posts as wives or partners of fur traders occupied particularly complex positions. They provided crucial services, language interpretation, cultural mediation, knowledge of food preservation and preparation techniques adapted to frontier conditions. But their status was often ambiguous, their security dependent on individual relationships rather than institutional protection. Winter must have been especially anxious for these women caught between worlds, dependent on structures that didn't fully recognize or protect them. Their knowledge and skills made them valuable, even essential, yet their value didn't translate into security or status in ways that white women might expect. They navigated multiple social systems simultaneously, maintaining positions that could collapse if relationships shifted, if traders moved on, if institutional priorities changed. The children growing up in these institutional settings experienced frontier winters differently from children in isolated cabins. Fort children, mission children, trading post children. They had playmates, peers who shared their circumstances, structured environments that provided routine even when resources were scarce. They still experienced cold and hunger, still endured the tedium of winter confinement, still suffered from the diseases and accidents that afflicted frontier life generally. But they did so as part of cohorts witnessed by communities, normalized by collective experience. An officer's son at Fort Pitt in 1805 might resent the limited diet, complain about the cold, feel frustrated by confinement. But he wasn't experiencing these hardships as signs of his family's potential failure, wasn't watching his parents' relationship with neighbors deteriorate, wasn't absorbing the lesson that trust was dangerous and self-sufficiency was safety. Instead, he learned different lessons about hierarchy and authority, about collective endurance, about the ways institutions could organize human life to distribute hardship more equitably. These lessons shaped different assumptions about society, about what could be expected from communities, about how survival might be organized. The institutional settings that sheltered some frontier inhabitants from the worst social and psychological effects of winter were themselves fragile, dependent on supply lines that could fail, on authority structures that could collapse, on institutional support that could be withdrawn. When these systems broke down, their inhabitants often found themselves even more vulnerable than isolated homesteaders who had at least developed skills in self-sufficiency and careful resource management. A fort whose supply convoy failed to arrive before winter closed the waterways could face catastrophe precisely because its inhabitants had been trained to depend on institutional provision rather than personal resourcefulness. Soldiers accustomed to regular rations might have no skills in hunting or foraging, no networks of mutual aid beyond the formal structures of military hierarchy. The dependency that institutional life created became dangerous when institutions failed. Men who had relied on regular distribution of provisions, who had never needed to hunt or preserve food, who had trusted that the institution would provide, suddenly faced winter with none of the adaptive skills that homesteaders developed through necessity. Trading posts cut off from company support faced similar vulnerabilities. The factors and voyageurs had grown dependent on regular resupply, had organized their lives around the assumption that the institution would provide. When it didn't, when storms or accidents or financial failures broke the supply chain, they discovered that institutional protection was conditional in ways that made its absence even more devastating than never having had it at all. The records document several such failures, posts where winter caught inhabitants unprepared because they'd trusted in structures that proved unreliable. A Hudson's Bay post stranded without supplies for an entire winter revealed how complete the dependency had become. Men who knew how to process furs, how to trade, how to navigate institutional hierarchies found themselves helpless when those hierarchies couldn't deliver the resources they'd been organized to provide. Mission communities faced related challenges when support from Eastern religious organizations faltered. Missionaries had built communities around promises of institutional backing, had encouraged native converts and frontier residents to depend on mission resources. When those resources failed to materialize, the mission's carefully constructed alternative to frontier isolation could collapse rapidly, leaving its members more vulnerable than if they'd maintained the wary, self-sufficient approach of scattered homesteaders. The betrayal of institutional failure added psychological damage to material deprivation. People who had trusted in the mission's promises, who had reorganized their lives around institutional support, who had perhaps alienated traditional communities in the process, found themselves stranded. The spiritual framework that had made hardship bearable became hollow when material support disappeared, revealing the degree to which faith had been sustained by reliable provision. Even when these institutional structures functioned as designed, they created dependencies that could become problematic in the long term. Soldiers completing their service and attempting to settle as homesteaders sometimes struggled with the transition from institutional provision to self-sufficiency. They'd been trained to obey orders, to depend on hierarchy, to operate within structures that made certain kinds of decisions for them. The psychological shift required to function as independent settlers, making all their own decisions, calculating all their own risks, navigating the complex social terrain of frontier neighborhoods, proved difficult for some. Records from land offices and county records show patterns of failed homesteads among former soldiers, men who took up land grants but couldn't sustain independent farming. The skills that made them effective soldiers, discipline, hierarchy, collective action, didn't translate directly to the skills needed for isolated frontier settlement. Voyageurs leaving company service to try independent trapping or trading faced similar challenges. They'd grown accustomed to the relative security of post life, to regular wages and provision, however meager, to social structures that were predictable, even if they were hierarchical. The independence of working for themselves came with freedoms, but also with anxieties they'd been protected from. The historical record includes accounts of failed transitions, men who couldn't adjust to the different psychological demands of self-sufficiency. One former voyageur's petition for relief to territorial authorities describes his failure to establish an independent trading operation. his inability to manage resources without institutional structure, his psychological collapse when faced with the isolation and uncertainty of working alone. The document reveals how thoroughly institutional life had shaped his capacities, how dependent he'd become on structures he'd barely noticed until they were removed. Yet despite these vulnerabilities and limitations, the institutional structures that sheltered some frontier inhabitants from winter's worst social pressures represented genuine alternatives to the isolated, mistrustful world of scattered homesteads. They demonstrated that winter hardship didn't have to produce social fragmentation, that collective organization could preserve human bonds even under extreme conditions. The question that haunts this comparison is not which model was better. Both had advantages and disadvantages. Both succeeded and failed depending on specific circumstances. The question is rather what it reveals about human nature and social organization, that winter's challenge could be met so differently depending on whether survival was individual or collective responsibility. The homesteaders who endured winter's isolation and watched their trust in neighbors erode weren't weak or antisocial by nature. Placed in institutional settings with collective provision and clear hierarchies, many would likely have maintained better social bonds, would have been spared the corrosive calculations that scarcity and dependence imposed. Similarly, the soldiers and traders and mission residents who experienced winter within protective institutional structures weren't necessarily more virtuous or community-minded. Placed in isolated cabins where their survival depended on their own stores and their neighbors' uncertain goodwill, many would likely have become just as calculating and mistrustful as the homesteaders they sometimes looked down upon. What winter revealed then was not the inherent character of different groups of frontier inhabitants, but the power of social organization to shape human behavior. It showed that trust and community were not just matters of individual virtue, but products of structures that either supported or undermined human connection. The structures themselves, military hierarchy, commercial organization, religious authority, succeeded not because they were particularly wise or humane, but because they removed survival from the realm of personal relationship. They made provision impersonal, which paradoxically made social relationships more sustainable because they weren't freighted with the weight of survival dependency. The frontier elite, the commandants and factors and missionaries who maintained authority through winter, occupied positions that protected them from the worst psychological pressures, not because they were stronger or better, but because their roles placed them above the desperate calculations that governed relations between approximate equals. Their privilege wasn't material luxury, but rather distance from the intimate anxieties that consumed those who depended on equals for survival. And this distance, this protection, this buffering from the worst of winter's social effects came at the cost of understanding. The letters and journals of frontier authorities often reveal genuine puzzlement about why homesteaders seemed so fractious, so reluctant to cooperate, so mired in petty disputes. They couldn't fully grasp what it meant to live 300 yards from someone you needed, but couldn't fully trust, to calculate every interaction against the possibility that your survival might depend on relationships you were simultaneously undermining through those very calculations. They had been spared that particular form of winter, and their protection made comprehension difficult. Their incomprehension wasn't willful or malicious. They simply lacked the experiential knowledge that would have made frontier social dynamics legible. No amount of observation could substitute for the lived experience of dependency on equals, the constant low-grade anxiety of never knowing whether one had given enough to maintain goodwill or whether asking for help would tip the balance into resentment. So winter divided the frontier not just geographically but psychologically, creating parallel worlds of experience that looked similar from outside but felt entirely different from within. Those who endured it in institutional settings could speak of community and collective endurance, could remember winter as a shared hardship that brought people together. Those who endured it in scattered cabins carried different memories, of silence and calculation, of trust eroded, of neighbors who were simultaneously essential and threatening, of a season that revealed just how fragile human bonds become when survival stops being certain. Both groups survived winter, but they survived it in ways that left entirely different marks on how they understood community, trust, and what people owe each other when owing anything might be too much. And so we arrive at the end of our quiet journey through winters that happened long ago, through cabins that have long since rotted back into earth, through lives that left only fragments and shadows for us to contemplate in the deep hours of night. Let us rest here for a moment and consider what these forgotten winters might tell us, what knowledge they preserved in silence and absence. The frontier families we've walked beside through these long months, Thomas Hendry and his wife Catherine, the unnamed homesteader watching smoke rise from a neighbor's distant chimney. The families who abandoned cabins midwinter rather than endure another season of careful words and calculated generosity. These people were not so different from us. They loved their children, hoped for better futures, tried to be good to their neighbors when circumstances allowed. What winter did to them, it did not through any flaw in their character, but through the simple, terrible arithmetic of scarcity meeting proximity. When survival depends on stores you've carefully accumulated, and those stores prove barely adequate and help might mean the difference between your family's survival and another's, then every interaction becomes weighted with implications that transform neighbors into something more complicated than friends or strangers. We've seen how this transformation happened slowly, not through dramatic betrayal, but through the accumulation of small moments, a tool borrowed and returned late, supplies lent with invisible strings of obligation attached, kindness offered but tallied in mental ledgers that could never quite balance. Winter didn't make people cruel, it made them careful, and that carefulness, that necessary self-protection, eroded trust more effectively than any overt hostility could have. The archaeological traces we've examined, the locked butter churn, the carefully hidden storage pits, the account books filled with anxious calculations, the letters that were written but never sent, these speak to a universal human struggle with the conflict between self-preservation and community obligation. They remind us that trust is not simply a virtue to be practiced, but a luxury that requires certain material and social conditions to be sustainable. The institutional alternatives we've explored, the forts with their hierarchical distribution, the trading posts with their corporate provision, the missions with their religious frameworks, these weren't perfect solutions. They created their own forms of inequality, their own dependencies and vulnerabilities, but they demonstrated that human beings can endure extreme hardship without turning against each other when survival is organized collectively rather than individually. When the burden of decision about who eats and who goes cold is distributed through institutional structures rather than falling on personal relationships between approximate equals. This perhaps is the deepest lesson winter preserved for us in its silent archive of abandoned cabins and unsent letters. Community is not natural or automatic or solely a matter of individual virtue. It requires structures that protect people from having to choose between their own survival and others, frameworks that distribute resources and obligations in ways that don't transform every human interaction into a calculation of advantage and debt. Without such structures, even good people in close proximity can become threats to each other, not through malice but through the inexorable logic of scarcity. The settlers who survived those harsh winters and went on to build the communities that eventually covered the frontier carried this knowledge with them, though they rarely spoke it aloud. You can see it in the institutions they built as soon as they were able, the community granaries, the mutual aid societies, the churches that organized charity, the local governments that took responsibility for roads and schools and poor relief. These weren't just practical conveniences, they were attempts to create structures that would prevent future winters from imposing the same terrible choices. that would collectivize survival enough that neighbors could remain neighbors rather than becoming wary competitors. Whether we in our own time have retained this wisdom is a question each listener might contemplate as sleep approaches. We live in an era of remarkable abundance compared to those frontier winters, yet we face our own forms of scarcity, of time, of security, of certainty about the future. The structures that once distributed survival's burden collectively have weakened in many places, replaced by individualized responsibility that tells each person to make their own way, to depend on themselves rather than community. Perhaps there are echoes of frontier winter in our own social landscape, shadows of that same transformation where proximity becomes burden and neighbors become calculating strangers. But this is a thought to set aside gently as we prepare for sleep, not to grasp too urgently. Our purpose tonight has been to drift through history's forgotten corners, to sit beside people long dead and feel what their winters felt like, to understand how seasons of cold and scarcity could reshape trust itself. If we've succeeded, then you've felt something of that cabin life, the weight of rationing, the anxiety of smoke rising from a distant chimney, the complexity of accepting kindness when kindness might create debt, the exhaustion of calculating every interaction against an uncertain future. You've walked through Thomas Hendry's winter, watched him struggle with moral questions that had no good answers, seen how ordinary decency became complicated when survival stopped being guaranteed. You've drifted through the archaeological mysteries, the phantom cabins abandoned midwinter, the butter churns fitted with locks, the graves standing isolated in communal cemeteries. You've sensed what history chose not to record directly, the social tensions too common or too uncomfortable to document, the erosion of trust that happened in the spaces between recorded events. And you've contrasted that world with the forts and trading posts, the institutional spaces where winter was still harsh but where its psychological burden was distributed differently, where hierarchy provided distance that paradoxically made human connection easier to maintain than it was between isolated equals. All of this, all these frozen landscapes and careful calculations and eroding relationships exists now only as memory and artifact, as fragments preserved in archives and objects displayed in small museums and patterns visible to archaeologists who know where to look. The people who lived through these winters have been dead for 2 centuries. Their cabins collapsed, their fields grown back to forest, their names mostly forgotten. What remains is the pattern, the lesson encoded in their experience. That community is fragile, that trust requires nurturing through structures that protect it from the corrosive effects of individual survival anxiety, that proximity without such protection can become burden rather than blessing. But winter always ended, we should remember that. April came eventually, bringing thaw and the promise of resupply and release from confinement. The families who had grown distant through months of careful calculation found themselves working in fields again, their children playing together again, the rhythms of warmer seasons gradually easing, if not entirely erasing, the tensions winter had created. Life continued, communities persisted, people found ways to be neighbors again. Even if the word neighbor carried new complexities it hadn't held before. And in time, decades, generations, the frontier itself transformed. More settlers arrived, towns formed, roads connected isolated homesteads, markets emerged that made families less dependent on immediate neighbors for survival. The specific pressures that had made winter so psychologically difficult gradually diminished, replaced by new pressures certainly, but different ones, pressures that didn't pit neighbor against neighbor in quite the same immediate, intimate way. The world that created frontier winter's social dynamics passed into history, remembered imperfectly, if at all. Yet the human dynamics it revealed remain relevant, remain worth contemplating in these quiet hours when the mind drifts between waking and sleep. Because we all navigate relationships that mix dependence with autonomy, cooperation with self-interest, community obligation with personal survival. We all make calculations about trust, about how much to give and how much to withhold, about when kindness is sustainable and when it becomes dangerous to our own well-being. Frontier winter simply made these calculations more visible, more urgent, more consequential than they usually are in times of abundance. So let these stories settle gently into your awareness as sleep approaches. Let the image of that isolated cabin in deep snow, smoke rising thin from its chimney, become a meditation on what humans need from each other and what we fear from each other when those needs grow urgent. Let Thomas Hendry's winter, his careful words with Robert Pratt, his avoidance of Mrs. Albright, his paralysis when smoke stopped rising from a distant chimney, become a reminder that moral complexity isn't failure, but simply the condition of being human in difficult circumstances. Let the locked butter churn, the hidden storage pit, the unsent letter of explanation and apology speak their quiet testimony about how survival can complicate even the simplest human connections, how scarcity can transform generosity into calculation without anyone intending that transformation. And let the forts and trading posts and missions with their hierarchies and institutional provisions, their collective management of winter's burdens, remind you that there are alternatives, that human beings have created structures throughout history to protect community bonds from the pressures that threaten to tear them apart. You are lying now in comfort those frontier families would have found unimaginable, warm without rationing fuel, secure in your supply of food, connected to vast networks of production and distribution that ensure your survival without requiring you to navigate the fraught intimacy of depending on individual neighbors. This comfort is worth appreciating, worth gratitude, worth protecting, but perhaps also worth contemplating is what was lost when that old interdependence disappeared. What knowledge about human connection and community obligation might have been forgotten along with the specific hardships that made such knowledge necessary. The frontier settlers knew things about trust and its limits, about community and its fragility, about what humans need from each other beyond material provision, that we in our more comfortable age might have lost. Not that we should wish to return to those conditions. No one who has truly understood what frontier winter meant to the people who endured it would romanticize or desire its return. But we might hold gently in awareness the paradox they lived, that proximity can be burden, that independence can be isolation, that the line between neighbor and threat can be disturbingly thin when circumstances grow difficult. Let your breathing slow now, let your body settle more deeply into rest. Let the images and stories of this journey begin to blur and fade like smoke dissipating into winter air. You've walked through a world that no longer exists except in fragments and memories, a world of careful words and calculated gestures, of trust eroded and community fragmented by the simple, terrible pressure of survival. You've stood beside people who tried to be good neighbors and found that trying wasn't always enough, who carried guilt for things they couldn't have done differently, who learned lessons about human nature and social organization that they rarely spoke aloud but that shaped how they lived afterward. You've felt winter not just as weather but as a season of the soul, a test that revealed what happens to human connection when it's subjected to sustained pressure. And now you can let all of this go, can release these stories back into history where they belong, can drift into sleep, carrying perhaps just the faintest awareness that community and trust are more complex and more fragile than we usually acknowledge, that the social bonds we often take for granted require conditions and structures and collective commitment to maintain. The frontier is long gone. Those particular winters ended 2 centuries ago. Thomas Hendry and Catherine and Robert Pratt and Mrs. Albright and all the unnamed others have been dust for generations. Their cabins have returned to forest, their fields to wilderness, their careful calculations forgotten by everyone except historians and archaeologists who piece together fragments of their lives. But the human struggles they faced, the moral complexities they navigated, the social dynamics they revealed, these echo across time, speaking quietly to anyone willing to listen about what we need from each other, what we fear from each other, and how thin the line between community and isolation can become when survival stops being certain. Rest now in the knowledge that you live in easier times, that your winters are warmer, that your survival doesn't depend on calculating every interaction with the few people who live closest to you. Let gratitude for that comfort carry you into sleep, gentle and deep and peaceful. And if somewhere in dreams you find yourself in a small cabin, watching smoke rise from a distant chimney across frozen fields, wondering what that smoke means and whether to walk through the cold to check on neighbors who might need help or might resent intrusion, remember that this is just memory now, history's dream, a world that existed but exists no longer. You can wake from it to warmth and plenty, to a life where neighbors are convenience rather than necessity, where community is choice rather than survival strategy, where winter is weather rather than test. The frontier has ended, the thaw has come, spring has arrived after that longest winter. Sleep now, peacefully, in the knowledge that those hard lessons have been learned and preserved, that those struggles have been endured and survived, that those winters have ended and will not return in their old form. The past has given us its gifts, its warnings, its wisdom, its testament to human resilience and human fragility. We carry these gifts forward into our own winters, whatever form they take, and we sleep easier for knowing what others before us endured and understood and passed along. Rest well, listener, wherever you are, whatever time shows on your clock. The journey is complete, the story told, the long winter finally ended. Let sleep come gently, carrying you into dreams warmer and kinder than frontier winters, into rest that frontier families would have treasured, into peace that arrives with gratitude for comfort and compassion for those who lived without it. The snow has melted, the ice has broken, spring has come at last, and morning, when it arrives, will find you rested and warm, far from those frozen landscapes of calculation and careful trust, safe in a world those frontier families helped build through their endurance, their struggles, their hard-won understanding of what it takes to remain human when being human becomes difficult. Sleep well, dream gently, rest deeply. The story has ended, the night embraces you, and all those distant winters have finally, mercifully, transformed into history's peaceful memory.